Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey back to a time of gilded cages and suffocating silks, to a royal court where perfume wasn't just for luxury, but for survival. Imagine yourself standing there, in the antechamber of a king, a place of immense power and terrible secrets. The air is heavy, not with the typical scent of beeswax and old paper, but with something far more sinister, something that the finest incense in the world can't quite mask. You probably won't survive this, not with your delicate modern sensibilities. The things they did to maintain appearances, well, let's just say a Zoom call with your camera off seems pretty tame in comparison. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the heart of the court, a world of whispers and hidden glances, where the rustle of a silken gown could signify a political alliance or a social downfall. You are, for all intents and purposes, a new courtier, recently arrived and still learning the labyrinthine rules of etiquette. The king, a stern, imposing figure, sits on his throne, his face a mask of stoic authority. But you notice something isn't quite right. The other courtiers, the ones who have been here for years, stand at a respectable distance. Their smiles are a little too fixed, their breathing just a little too shallow. A fine layer of powder, the kind meant to cover a bad complexion, seems to be caked on every single nose in the room. You can almost taste the rosewater and lavender, a cloying cloud that hangs in the air, thick enough to be a physical presence. It's all a performance, a grand theatrical charade to hide a simple yet terrifying truth. The princess, the king's only daughter, the heir to the throne, is rotting away. The first time you see her, she's just a flicker of movement behind a velvet curtain, a shadow of a figure draped in layers of heavy fabric, her face almost entirely obscured by a delicate fan. Yet, even from a distance, an unmistakable miasma seems to precede her, an odour that is both sickly sweet and profoundly foul. It's the smell of decay, of something that has gone wrong at a fundamental cellular level. Your stomach lurches, and you instinctively take a small step back, bumping into another courtier who shoots you a withering look. "You'll get used to it," they whisper, their voice barely audible over the drone of the royal orchestra, "or you'll leave." And just like that, the rules of the court become clear. This is not a place of open conversation, but of silent complicity. You're expected to see nothing, smell nothing, and say nothing. The princess's name is on everyone's lips, but only in hushed, reverent tones. She's a symbol of beauty and grace, a living legend. The reality is something else entirely. Historians still argue whether the condition was a rare genetic disorder, a debilitating illness, or perhaps even a curse, but the effect was the same. Her body, even as a young girl, was in a constant state of putrefaction, a slow, biological unravelling. Mainstream historical records from the era often gloss over such unpleasantries, preferring to describe the princess as of delicate constitution, or blessed with a peculiar scent that only the pious could appreciate. But the letters and diaries of lesser-known courtiers, the ones whose names have long since been forgotten, tell a very different story. One particularly quirky tidbit comes from the journal of a disgraced perfumer who was tasked with creating a fragrance for the princess. He wrote of his despair, of a scent so powerful it overpowered even the strongest musk of the civet cat, and a body so frail it bruised at a mere touch of fine linen. He claimed his own sense of smell was permanently ruined, a professional tragedy that led to his eventual exile from the court. You watch as a servant, a young boy with eyes wide with terror, approaches the princess. He carries a silver platter piled high with fresh jasmine and lilies. As he gets closer, you see him flinch, his hand trembling so much that a few petals fall to the floor. The princess, behind her fan, makes a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and the boy retreats, his mission complete. The flowers, you realise, are not for her enjoyment. They're a desperate, futile attempt to create a barrier, a fragrant shield against the truth. It's a game of smoke and mirrors, a carefully constructed illusion that everyone is forced to participate in. To acknowledge the smell is to acknowledge the truth, and to acknowledge the truth is to risk everything. The king's power is built on the myth of his perfect lineage, and a rotting princess doesn't fit into that narrative. You've heard the whispers of how he spent fortunes on exotic perfumes, on rare spices, on alchemists and physicians from every corner of the known world, all in a desperate failing bid to save his daughter and, by extension, his own reputation. The grandeur of the court is a strange paradox. The walls are covered in priceless tapestries, the floors are polished to a mirror sheen, and the chandeliers drip with crystals that catch the light like 1,000 tiny stars. But underneath it all, there's the creeping sense of something terribly wrong, a silent, pervasive rot that threatens to unravel the entire facade. You see the Queen, a woman of dignified beauty, her face a mask of carefully constructed serenity. But you notice the tiny, almost invisible lines of strain around her eyes, the way her grip tightens on her fan every time her daughter is mentioned. This is a court living in a state of suspended animation, a kingdom holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when the illusion shatters. You find yourself feeling a peculiar kind of pity for the princess, this girl-turned-woman who has never known a moment of genuine warmth or closeness. For who could bear to embrace a body that is actively betraying itself? Her life is a solitary existence, a gilded prison of her own decaying flesh. The air thickens and a new wave of perfume, this time a heavy resinous frankincense, is carried on the breeze from a nearby censer. You find yourself wondering what she smells like to herself, this woman whose body is a living tomb. Does she wake up to the knowledge of her own putrefaction? Does she feel the silent judgment of every person who enters her orbit? It's a terrifying thought, one that makes the elaborate court rituals and the endless procession of sycophants seem utterly hollow. This is a story not just about a princess, but about the lengths people will go to for the sake of appearances, and the terrible price of maintaining a perfect lie. You, the new courtier, are now a part of it all. You are a player in this macabre play, and the stage is set. The curtain has just been pulled back, and the stench is the first thing you notice. Now you must decide if you will hold your breath and play your part, or if you will be the one to break the silence and face the consequences. The princess, you come to learn, was not born a stranger to the sun. Her early life, before the rot took hold, was by all accounts quite normal, or as normal as a royal childhood could be. You see her in your mind's eye as a tiny girl, a child queen in miniature, with rosy cheeks and a laugh that supposedly echoed through the marble halls. The court painters, ever the great liars of their day, have left behind portraits of a cherubic child with a smile that could melt the winter snows. They show her with a pet lamb, with a gilded doll, with a book of fairy tales, a picture of perfect, innocent privilege. You, however, are now privy to the truth behind the canvas. You understand that these images are less about capturing a moment and more about constructing a legacy, a pristine, untainted image for a world that demanded perfection from its rulers. Her name, you discover through the hushed tones of older courtiers, was Theodora, a name that means gift of God, a cruel irony that now hangs in the air like a pall. She was the apple of her father's eye, the king's great hope for the future of his dynasty. Mainstream historical accounts from the time describe her early years with a kind of breathless awe, focusing on her quick wit and her remarkable memory. They speak of a child who could recite epic poems from memory and who charmed foreign ambassadors with her grace and intelligence. This is the official version of events, the story that was meant to be told for generations. But as you navigate the corridors of power, you hear the other stories, the ones whispered behind closed doors. There's a quirky little tidbit from the court gossip that describes her as a child who had an unnatural fondness for cold, damp places. She would reportedly spend hours in the royal cellar, playing among the barrels of wine and the stacks of aging cheese, a place no other child would dare to venture due to the pervasive mustiness. Her nursemaids would search for her for hours, only to find her happily playing in the cool darkness. Historians still argue whether this was an early sign of her later condition, a subconscious seeking of an environment that slowed the putrefaction, or simply the eccentric behaviour of a bored, intelligent child. Whatever the reason, it stands as a peculiar and slightly unsettling footnote in the story of her childhood. The first subtle signs of her affliction appeared in her adolescence, a time when a princess is meant to blossom into a woman fit for marriage. It started with a persistent, almost imperceptible odour that no amount of scrubbing or perfuming could eliminate. At first it was dismissed as a musky scent, the kind that was fashionable in some circles. But you know better. You know that this was the very beginning of the end, the first crack in the porcelain doll. The official court narrative began to shift. Theodora was no longer a vivacious girl, but a delicate young woman who required extended periods of rest. Her public appearances grew fewer and fewer, and when she did attend a state function, she was swathed in veils and cloaks, her face and body hidden from view. You can almost feel the collective denial of the court. The king, a man who had once doted on his daughter, now seemed to flinch at her approach. The queen, ever the pragmatist, became an expert at creating distance, at finding plausible reasons for Theodora to be absent. "The princess has a headache," she would say, or "the princess is observing a period of spiritual reflection." The excuses were endless, a flimsy wall built to hold back an incoming tide of scandal. Theodora, in turn, retreated into herself, a prisoner in her own decaying body. She became a ghost in her own home, a fleeting shadow in the palace that she was meant to rule. Her laughter was replaced by a sombre silence, and her quick wit by a quiet, resigned melancholy. You see the tragedy of it all, a vibrant young life slowly being extinguished by a terrible secret affliction. This is a mainstream historical fact that is often overlooked. The medieval and early modern courts were obsessed with lineage and physical perfection. A monarch's health was seen as a reflection of the health of the kingdom itself. A sick or infirm ruler was not just a personal tragedy, it was a political liability. Theodora's father, the king, was not just trying to protect his daughter. He was trying to protect his throne, his bloodline, his entire kingdom. His desperation, which you can now see in the forced smile and the twitch in his jaw, was not just paternal love, but a raw political fear. He knew that if the truth got out, his enemies would seize on it, using his daughter's condition as proof that his family was cursed, that his rule was illegitimate. A rotting princess was not just a medical problem, she was a matter of state security. You see a glimmer of her old self in a rare moment, a flash of defiance in her eyes as she stares out a window, her face still mostly hidden by a fan. She is a woman trapped in a cage of her own flesh, but the fire of her intelligence is not yet fully extinguished. You wonder what she thinks about as she watches the world from behind her window pane. Does she dream of dancing at a ball, of riding her horse through the open fields, of a life she can never have? Does she resent the king for his attempts to hide her away, or does she understand the terrible political calculus of his actions? You can only speculate, but you sense a deep, profound loneliness radiating from her, a loneliness so complete that it must be a physical weight. The court, with its endless parades of suitors and potential alliances, became a minefield for the king. How do you present a rotting princess to a potential husband? Do you pretend she is ill? Do you feign a sudden, deep piety that requires her to be cloistered? The king's advisers, a collection of old men with tired eyes and even more tired ideas, debated endlessly. The most common solution, of course, was to find a suitor who was either desperate for power, blind, or both. It's a dark thought, a grim joke that you can't help but appreciate the morbid humour of. Imagine the sales pitch. She's got a great personality, and an even greater dowry. You'll just need to bring your own air fresheners. This period of her life, this slow descent into reclusiveness, is the most tragic part of her story. This is where the girl you saw in the portraits truly died, replaced by a walking, breathing secret. Theodora became an object, a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. You feel a pang of sympathy for her, for this beautiful, intelligent girl who was stripped of her life and her humanity by a cruel twist of fate and the unforgiving demands of her position. The kingdom celebrated her birthday with grand feasts and tournaments, but the guest of honour was always absent, a silent, fragrant ghost that haunted the festivities. The roses and lilies that adorned the tables were a cruel mockery of her condition, a reminder of the beautiful, fleeting life that she could never truly live. And so, the stage is set. The princess is no longer a child, but a woman, and her condition is no longer a secret confined to the king's closest circle. The stench is becoming undeniable, a constant presence that permeates the very stone of the palace. The whispers are no longer about her wit, but about her delicate scent. The court is now a theatre of the absurd where everyone is forced to play a role they don't want, pretending not to notice the elephant in the room that smells suspiciously of death and decaying flowers. You're a part of this now, an unwilling actor in a tragedy that is unfolding in slow, agonizing detail. And you know deep down that this charade cannot last forever. Something has to give. The princess, a walking testament to the fragility of power and the cruelty of fate, is a ticking time bomb. You've been at court long enough now for the veneer of denial to begin to chip away. The polite fictions of a delicate constitution and a unique personal scent are wearing thin, like an old tapestry threadbare from too much use. You're no longer the wide-eyed newcomer, but a full-fledged participant in the grand charade. The palace, once a place of breathtaking beauty, now feels like a tomb, its very stones seeming to absorb the ever-present miasma. You find yourself unconsciously holding your breath when you're in the West Wing, where the princess's chambers are, and you've learned to douse your own clothes in lavender water before attending any official functions. The first whiff of true, undeniable decay came not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, insidious change. At first, it was a subtle, almost floral sweetness, the kind that might accompany a bouquet of flowers left to wilt for too long. But this sweetness had a darker, more troubling undercurrent, a hint of something sour and metallic, like old blood and spoiled fruit. You learned from the hushed whispers that it began with her hair. The princess's hair, once the colour of spun gold, began to lose its lustre, and, according to a panicked lady-in-waiting, would fall out in handfuls, leaving a strange oily residue on her pillow. This was the first physical manifestation, the first undeniable sign that something was deeply, terribly wrong. The king, in his growing desperation, had a special team of perfumers brought in. Mainstream historical accounts from the time often refer to a royal fragrance initiative, a program designed to create a signature scent for the kingdom's nobility. This is the sanitized version. The reality, as you know from the court gossip, was far less glamorous. These perfumers were not tasked with creating a scent for the court, but with creating a scent to hide the princess. One quirky fringe tidbit you've heard is that they experimented with all manner of bizarre ingredients, including a kind of powdered ambergris harvested from the belly of a whale, which they believed had unique properties to neutralize foul odors. The court jester, a man whose job it was to tell uncomfortable truths wrapped in humor, once quipped that the perfumers were no longer artisans, but royal embalmers in training. The joke was met with a chilling silence. The princess's wardrobe became another battleground in the war against her affliction. She was now dressed in a continuous succession of new clothes, layers upon layers of silk and velvet, often scented with rose and jasmine. You notice that her clothes are never reworn. They are worn once, sometimes for only a few hours, and then they are quietly taken away, burned in the royal gardens under the cover of night. This is a massive drain on the royal treasury, a fact that the king's financial ministers are very worried about. The royal coffers are being emptied not by wars or lavish parties, but by the relentless silent war against a single pervasive stench. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of this was more devastating than the physical one. Imagine living your life as a walking problem, a person defined not by your character or your intelligence, but by the fact that you smell of death. You are Theodora, and you know with a terrible certainty that every person who enters your presence is holding their breath. You know that the flowers they bring you are not gifts of love, but weapons in a war. You know that the heavy perfumes they douse themselves in are not for their own pleasure, but for their own survival. The isolation must have been complete, a wall of perfumed air that separated her from every other human being. Theodora had been a vibrant, intelligent child, and you can only imagine the quiet horror of watching her own body turn against her. The king's desperation manifested in more than just perfume and clothing. He became obsessed with the concept of air, believing that a change in the atmosphere of the palace might solve the problem. He had windows opened in the dead of winter, creating frigid drafts that made the whole court miserable. He hired engineers to build a new kind of ventilation system, a series of bellows and shafts meant to constantly circulate fresh air through the princess's chambers. The whole scheme was a ludicrous, expensive failure, and only succeeded in making the stench more mobile, a ghastly fog that could now drift into the throne room during official audiences. You are witness to a particularly grim episode. A young page, new to the court, is tasked with delivering a message to the princess. He's a handsome boy, full of the bravado of youth, and he has heard the whispers but does not truly believe them. He enters her chamber, a place thick with the scent of lilies and beeswax, and you hear a stifled gasp from the other side of the heavy oak door. The The boy emerges a few minutes later, pale and shaking, his face a mask of shock and nausea. He's quickly taken away, and you never see him again. The incident becomes another cautionary tale whispered in the kitchens and servants' quarters, another testament to the horror that lies behind the velvet curtains. The princess, you understand, is not a person anymore, but a force of nature, a kind of walking contagion that must be contained at all costs. The silence around her condition is the most deafening part of the whole affair. The king would not tolerate any mention of it, not a single word. To speak of the princess's scent was a crime punishable by exile, or worse. The official line was that she was a delicate flower, a fragile beauty who was simply more sensitive to the vulgarities of the world. The court, a collective of cowards and sycophants, eagerly adopted this lie. They would nod and smile and talk about her ethereal beauty and otherworldly grace, all while trying to discreetly hold a scented handkerchief to their faces. It's a macabre comedy, a dance of lies and deceit where the only honest actor is the silent, rotting body of the princess herself. You feel a strange kind of complicity in all of this. By being here, by breathing the perfumed air and saying nothing, you are a part of the cover-up. You are an extra in a Greek tragedy where the hero is the king and the victim is his own daughter, and the chorus is a bunch of terrified courtiers who are too scared to tell the truth. The court is a gilded cage, and you are all prisoners within it, bound by the terrible secret of the rotting princess. The sweet, sickly smell is no longer just a physical thing. It has become a moral one, a scent of corruption that has seeped into the very soul of the kingdom. And you know that this can't go on forever. The stench, like the truth, will eventually out. The court's charade, however meticulously maintained, could not withstand the king's growing desperation. The endless stream of perfumers and herbalists had failed, their efforts amounting to little more than a temporary fragrant bandage on a gaping wound. The king, a man unaccustomed to defeat, began to cast his net wider, beyond the known world of conventional medicine. He sent his agents to the farthest corners of the globe seeking a cure, no matter how unorthodox. You hear the whispers of his scouts returning with tales of strange rituals and bizarre remedies, of crocodile dung sunscreen from the Nile and powdered mummy from the deserts. This was the dark, unglamorous side of empire, the exploitation of other cultures for a cure that no one truly believed existed. One day, the court is abuzz with a different kind of rumour. A new arrival is expected, not a diplomat or a merchant, but a man of science, a physician whose reputation is whispered in hushed, reverent tones. His name is Dr. Alistair Finch. Unlike the other doctors who wore their expensive silks and carried silver-tipped canes, Finch arrives in a simple, practical tunic, his leather satchel bulging with strange tools and worn notebooks. He is a man of humble origins, but with a mind that, according to the tales, was as sharp as a scalpel. He had made his name not by catering to the whims of the wealthy, but by curing the poor of ailments that others had deemed untreatable. He was, in short, everything the royal physicians were not: honest, unconventional, and terrifyingly competent. You find yourself watching him from a distance, a figure of fascination and dread. He's brought into the throne room, and unlike the other courtiers who hold their perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, he breathes normally. He looks around the room, not with the typical sycophantic gaze, but with the cool, analytical eye of a man observing a strange specimen. He bows to the king, a respectful but not servile gesture, and you sense that he is a man who fears neither God nor king, only ignorance and disease. He is, you realise, the court's last, best hope. Mainstream historical records from the period mention a sudden shift in the royal court's medical philosophy, with a greater emphasis placed on empirical observation and a decline in the influence of traditional humours-based medicine. This is a sanitised, scholarly explanation for what was a profound personal crisis. The king had thrown away the rulebook. He had put his daughter's life and his kingdom's reputation in the hands of a commoner who believed in observation over dogma. This was an act of genuine desperation, a gamble that could either save his daughter or plunge his court into chaos. A quirky tidbit you overhear from a stable boy who helped with Finch's luggage is that the doctor's satchel contained not just traditional medical instruments, but also a collection of glass jars filled with various insects, a small, intricate microscope, and a book bound in what looked like human skin. This detail, likely embellished by the boy's vivid imagination, still sends a shiver down your spine. It painted a picture of a man who was not afraid to get his hands dirty, a man who was willing to look at things that others found repulsive. He was a pioneer, a proto-scientist in a world still steeped in superstition, and his methods were as shocking as they were promising. Historians still argue whether Finch's initial diagnosis of the princess's condition was based on true scientific insight or a lucky guess. He was the first to dismiss the talk of curses and divine punishment. He spent weeks in the princess's chambers, not just prescribing medicine, but observing. He took samples of her skin, her breath, and even the air in her room, using his bizarre instruments to examine them. He was a scientist, a detective, and a doctor all in one, and he was completely unfazed by the pervasive odour that made others flee. His calm demeanour and professional curiosity were a stark contrast to the hysteria and denial of the court. He treated the princess not as a walking tragedy, but as a fascinating medical puzzle, and you sensed that this was the first time in years that Theodora was treated as a person, and not a problem. The king, in a quiet moment of vulnerability, confided in his closest advisers that Finch's presence had a calming effect on the princess. She seemed to respond to his matter-of-fact approach, his lack of pity, and his genuine fascination with her condition. He was a man who looked at her and saw a patient, not a monster, and for Theodora, this was a kind of miracle in itself. You can only imagine the relief she must have felt, to be looked at not with revulsion, but with curiosity. It was a small kindness, but in her world it was an immense one. The king's hope, once a flicker, now burned brighter. He gave Finch an unprecedented amount of freedom, allowing him to bypass the traditional court physicians and to command whatever resources he needed. Finch, in his characteristic bluntness, requested a private laboratory, a steady supply of exotic chemicals, and a team of assistants who were not afraid of a bit of a pong. The court, terrified but desperate, complied. The palace was no longer just a place of politics and parties, but a laboratory, a crucible where a brilliant mind was at work trying to undo a terrible wrong. You, as a courtier, are now privy to the doctor's progress, or lack thereof. The whispered news from his lab is a strange mix of hope and despair. He's trying new tinctures, new compresses, new methods of dietary control. He's attempting to slow the process of decay, to stop the biological unravelling that is happening inside the princess's body. You see her on rare occasions being wheeled through the halls in a sedan chair, a heavy curtain drawn to protect her from the stares of the court. But you also notice something new, a slight improvement in her complexion, a less pronounced pallor. It's a tiny victory, a small ray of hope in the overwhelming darkness, and the court holds its collective breath, waiting for a miracle that may or may not come. The arrival of Doctor Finch has changed the atmosphere of the court in an unexpected way. The perfumers are gone, the ridiculous ventilation systems are dismantled, and the frantic, panicked cover-up has been replaced by a quiet, professional determination. The lie is still there, of course, but it is a different kind of lie now, a lie of hope. The court is no longer pretending that the princess is fine. They are now pretending that she will be fine, that a cure is just around the corner. It's a subtle but crucial difference, and it has given the king a new lease on life, a new reason to believe that his daughter and his kingdom can be saved. You feel a strange sense of optimism yourself, a belief that this eccentric, brilliant man might just be the one to solve the unsolvable riddle of the rotting princess. Hope, you learn, is a fragile thing, especially in a place built on lies. The king's newfound optimism, so eagerly adopted by the court, proved to be a fleeting phantom. You watched as Dr. Finch, the brilliant maverick who had seemed so promising, began to show the signs of defeat. The jaunty confidence that had once radiated from him was replaced by a grim, professional exhaustion. His experiments, once so full of a mad sort of genius, became increasingly desperate, a frantic search for a solution that seemed to be actively avoiding him. The princess, the subject of his intense study, was not getting better. In fact, her condition seemed to be worsening, as if her body, in a final terrible act of defiance, was accelerating its own decay. The whispers in the court returned, more venomous than before. The sycophants, who had been so quick to praise the king for his progressive choice of physician, were now muttering about Finch's heretical methods and blasphemous experiments. The traditional physicians, who had been sidelined, now held their heads a little higher, their smugness a physical presence in the room. They had been right all along, they believed. You can't cure a curse with science. Theodora was a divine punishment, and the king's attempts to thwart fate were an affront to God himself. Mainstream historical documents from the time refer to a period of medical stagnation, a time when the court's faith in scientific inquiry waned and they returned to traditional herbal remedies and spiritual rituals. This is the sanitized textbook version. The reality was a humiliating public failure. Finch's grand ideas were being dismantled one by one. The special laboratory he had constructed was being repurposed, his bizarre equipment packed away. The princess was once again confined to her chambers, the heavy curtains drawn, and the royal perfumers were back, their expensive concoctions once again failing to mask the stench. A quirky little tidbit from a lady-in-waiting's diary reveals the most heartbreaking aspect of this failure. She wrote of a time when Finch believed he had found a cure, a potent tincture derived from a rare desert plant. He administered it to the princess, and for a few precious hours, the lady-in-waiting wrote, the smell seemed to recede. The princess, for the first time in years, was able to sit in a sun-drenched room with an open window. She even managed a genuine smile. But the effect was short-lived. By the next morning, the stench was back, more powerful than before, as if the disease itself had been angered by the attempt to cure it. The princess's smile was gone, replaced by a deep, profound sadness. Hope, the lady-in-waiting wrote, is the cruelest poison. Historians still argue whether Finch's methods had any lasting positive effect at all, or if they simply prolonged the princess's suffering. Was the momentary respite a genuine medical breakthrough, or just a psychological illusion born of wishful thinking? There is no way to know for sure. What is certain is that the princess's condition, once a slow and insidious process, now seemed to be accelerating. The decay was no longer just an odour, but a visible physical reality. Her skin, once so pale and translucent, now had a mottled, unhealthy cast to it. The heavy perfumes and the layers of silk could no longer hide the truth. The rotting was now undeniable, a testament to Finch's failed but valiant efforts. You find yourself feeling a peculiar kind of pity for Finch. The court, in its fickle cruelty, had turned on him completely. The man who had been hailed as a genius was now seen as a charlatan, a fool who had dared to challenge God's will. He was forced to leave the palace, his reputation in tatters, his dreams of a cure shattered. His farewell was a quiet, unceremonious affair. No one wished him well. He left as he arrived, a solitary figure with his worn leather satchel, a man who had tried to do the impossible and paid a terrible price for his audacity. His departure was a kind of death in itself, a final nail in the coffin of the king's hope. The king, in the wake of Finch's failure, became a different man. The desperation that had fueled his search for a cure was replaced by a bitter, almost manic resolve. He was no longer trying to cure the princess, he was trying to hide her. The cover-up became an obsession, a fortress of lies built to protect his reputation and his throne. The princess was now a permanent recluse, her face and body completely hidden from view. She was a living myth, a story that the court had to believe, even as her stench grew stronger and more pervasive. The illusion was now everything. The court was now a place of silent terror. The princess's condition was no longer a secret confined to the king's inner circle. The palace staff, the gardeners, the stable boys, everyone knew. The smell had seeped into the very air, a constant reminder of the rotting heart of the kingdom. The king's power, once so unshakable, now felt brittle, held together by the threadbare lies of his courtiers. The kingdom's alliances were now at risk. How could a king who couldn't protect his own daughter from a foul disease be trusted to protect a nation from its enemies? The king's enemies, you knew, were already sniffing the air, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This is the point in the story where the tragedy truly begins. The girl you imagined in the portraits, the woman who was briefly given a flicker of hope by a brilliant doctor, is now gone. She's a prisoner of her own flesh, a human being reduced to a political problem, a biological failure. The king's desperation has turned into a kind of madness, and the court, a willing accomplice, is slowly but surely descending into a moral abyss. You are all players in a play where the stage is set with 1,000 lies, and the final act, you know, is not going to be a happy one. The rotting princess is no longer just a personal tragedy. She's a national crisis, a ticking time bomb of scandal and decay that is about to explode in the king's face. With Dr. Finch's departure, the king's desperation metastasized into a kind of manic control. You see it in the way his eyes dart around the room, perpetually searching for any sign of dissent, any whisper of a rumour that might threaten his carefully constructed lie. The palace, once a place of bustling life, now feels like a tomb. The heavy perfumes and incense are no longer subtle attempts to mask a scent. They are weapons, used to bludgeon the senses into submission. The court is now a place where you don't just hold your breath. You're expected to breathe in the suffocating lie itself, to inhale the pleasant fiction of a healthy, beautiful princess. The princess herself is now a prisoner in every sense of the word. Her chambers are sealed, the windows bolted shut, and her every need is attended to by a small circle of loyal, or perhaps just terrified, servants who have been sworn to secrecy. She's no longer seen at all, not even as a fleeting shadow behind a curtain. She's a name, a royal title, and a terrible, pervasive odour. The king has all but erased her from public life, and in doing so he has created an even more potent myth. The myth of a princess who is so beautiful, so ethereal, that she must be kept from the vulgar gaze of the world. It's a ridiculous, desperate lie, but it's the only one he has left. Mainstream historical records of the time mention a period of increased royal seclusion, often citing the king's piety and the princess's fragile spiritual state. This is the official story, the one that was meticulously crafted by the king's public relations team, which, in a time before such a thing existed, was made up of the court's poets, chroniclers, and priests. They wrote of a princess who spent her days in prayer and meditation, a living saint whose beauty was too pure for this world. It was a beautiful fiction, a story meant to deflect attention from the terrible truth that was rotting away in the west wing of the palace. The lengths to which the king went to hide the truth were both ludicrous and terrifying. A quirky tidbit from a retired palace groundskeeper reveals that he was given a royal mandate to grow specific types of flowers, the most fragrant, the most overpowering, not for their beauty, but for their scent. He was instructed to plant them in specific patterns around the west wing of the palace, creating a scent wall that would, in theory, overpower the princess's own miasma. The groundskeeper, a simple man who just wanted to grow his cabbages in peace, was forced to become a perfumer in the dirt, a botanical soldier in the king's war against decay. Historians still argue whether the king's actions were motivated more by a desperate paternal love or by a cold political calculus. Did he lock his daughter away to protect her from the world's cruelty, or to protect his throne from the political fallout of a rotting heir? The truth, you suspect, is a muddled mess of both. He was a father who had lost his daughter to a terrible illness, and a king who was watching his kingdom teeter on the brink of a legitimacy crisis. His actions were a desperate, failing attempt to satisfy both roles, to be a protector of his family and his country. The court, now a place of silent, terrified compliance, became an expert at denial. You see it in the eyes of the other courtiers, the way they pretend not to notice the constant burning of incense, the way they talk about the princess as if she were a living, breathing person, not a ghost who haunts the West Wing. To acknowledge the truth, to even hint at it, was to invite the king's wrath, and no one was willing to take that risk. So, the lies became bigger, the fictions more elaborate, and the stench, in a cruel irony, became stronger. It was a vicious cycle of denial and decay, a dance of death that no one was willing to stop. You yourself have become a master of this silent game. You nod at the right times, you murmur the appropriate platitudes about the princess's piety and grace, and you do your best to avoid the West Wing, a place that now feels less like a part of the palace and more like a crime scene. You learn to read the subtle signals of the court, the flinching of a courtier's nose, the quick, furtive glance at the West Wing, the sudden rush of a servant to light another censer. This is your new reality, a world where what is unsaid is far more important than what is spoken. The king, in his isolation and fear, became a tyrant. He lashed out at the slightest provocation, his paranoia growing with every passing day. He saw enemies everywhere, traitors who he believed were conspiring to expose his daughter's secret. He had loyal servants banished, old friends imprisoned, all on the basis of a misplaced word or a suspicious glance. The court, once a place of vibrant political intrigue, was now a place of fear and silence. The rotting princess was not just an illness, she was a political weapon, a source of terror that the king wielded against anyone who dared to question his rule. You find yourself feeling a strange kind of sympathy for the princess. She's not the architect of this madness, but its silent victim. She's a symbol of a kingdom's decay, a human sacrifice on the altar of her father's power. She's locked away, her existence a ghost story whispered in the kitchens, her scent a constant, terrible reminder of the king's desperate, failing lie. Her life is a profound tragedy, a story of a young woman who was born into privilege and who was cursed with a body that betrayed her, and a father who was too terrified to save her. The king's efforts to silence the court and hide his daughter were a success, at least for now. The lie held. The kingdom, on the surface, seemed stable. But you know that this stability is a fiction, a house of cards built on a foundation of decaying flesh and 1,000 lies. The princess's stench is the wind that is threatening to blow it all down, and you know, with a terrible certainty, that it's only a matter of time before the whole thing comes crashing down around you. You're all living on borrowed time, and the air, thick with perfume and lies, is running out. The king's iron grip on the court, his suffocating web of silence and denial, was not born of cruelty alone. It was the product of a profound and, frankly, pathetic fear. You find yourself observing the courtiers, the men and women who have become masters of this terrible game. Their faces are placid. Their conversations are about the weather, the latest fashions, or the exploits of a foreign dignitary. But underneath the veneer of polite society you see the tension. The slightest rustle of silk near the west wing makes them flinch. The heavy, sweet scent of burning frankincense makes them subtly, almost imperceptibly, cover their noses with a hand that is supposedly adjusting a piece of jewellery. This is a court in a state of collective, unspoken psychosis. They are all pretending not to notice the elephant in the room, that, quite frankly, smells like a compost heap in August. It's a game of social survival, where the penalty for losing is not just a loss of status, but potentially a loss of your head. The king, in his paranoia, had made it clear that any mention of his daughter's condition was an act of treason. So they learned to lie, not just to the king, but to themselves. The princess was a figment of their collective imagination, a beautiful, virtuous saint who was far too good for this world. Mainstream historical narratives of this era often praise the court for its discipline and decorum, citing its ability to function under immense pressure and maintain a united front against its enemies. This is, of course, the sanitized public version of events. The truth, as you know, is that the court was a pressure cooker of repressed fear and barely contained disgust. The king's enemies didn't need to attack. The court was already rotting from the inside out, a mirror image of the princess herself. The kingdom was a metaphor, and the metaphor was not a pleasant one. A quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit you overhear from a palace laundry maid is that the princess's bed linens were never washed. They were instead burned. Every week, a small, sombre procession of servants would carry the heavy scented linens to a remote corner of the royal grounds and incinerate them in a specially constructed furnace. The smoke, you are told, was thick and black, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odour that the groundskeepers had learned to dread. This was the extent of the cover-up, a desperate, wasteful ritual that was both a practical necessity and a terrible physical manifestation of the king's lie. Historians still argue whether this collective denial was a conscious choice or a kind of mass hysteria. Were the courtiers truly so afraid of the king that they would deny their own senses? Or was the psychological pressure so immense that their minds simply refused to accept the evidence before them? It's a question of human nature, a study in the lengths to which people will go to protect themselves, even from the truth. The court was a society built on a lie, and the princess was the living, breathing proof of its fragility. You yourself have become a part of this collective denial. You catch yourself almost flinching when a particularly strong waft of incense hits your nose, but you quickly compose yourself, your face a mask of serene composure. You have learned to talk around the subject of the princess, to praise her in vague, flowery terms, to avoid any specific details about her well-being. It is a linguistic tightrope, and the slightest misstep could be fatal. The court is a place of endless silent performance, and the rotting princess is the silent star of the show. The king, in his manic resolve, had created a palace that was a parody of itself. The grand halls were filled with the sound of laughter and music, but the laughter was forced, and the music was a distraction. The lavish feasts were a testament to the kingdom's prosperity, but the food, you notice, is often untouched, as the courtiers' stomachs are often too knotted with fear and nausea to eat. The palace is a beautiful lie, and its beauty is a mockery of the rot that lies at its heart. The king, in his private moments, must have felt a terrible loneliness. He was the architect of this lie, the man who had forced his entire court to deny the evidence of their own senses. He was a father who had to pretend his daughter was a saint, when he knew, with a terrible certainty, that she was a living, breathing tragedy. He was a king who was forced to rule a kingdom that was slowly but surely being poisoned by a secret that he was too terrified to reveal. He was the most powerful man in the kingdom, and also the most helpless. The court's unspoken secret was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was a weight that they all carried, a burden that was never spoken, never acknowledged. The princess was not a person. She was a symbol of their collective fear and their individual cowardice. She was the dark, terrible heart of the kingdom, and you know with a kind of morbid certainty that this can't last forever. A lie this big, this rotten, is destined to be exposed, and when it is, the fallout will be catastrophic. The palace will crumble, the king will fall, and the court will be plunged into a chaos that they are not prepared for. The stench is a warning, a terrible harbinger of the disaster that is to come, and you, as a silent witness, are trapped in the centre of it all. The stage is set, the actors are in place, and the final act is about to begin. The entrance of a suitor, a prince from a distant land, is the opening bell, and you know, with a terrible sinking feeling, that he is the one who's going to blow the whole thing apart. The kingdom's precarious stability, a house of cards built on lies and decaying flesh, was about to be tested in the most perilous way imaginable. The whispers that had been so carefully suppressed suddenly changed in tone. They were no longer about the princess's piety or the king's paranoia, but about a foreign dignitary, a prince from a far-off land, a suitor who was coming to court the king's daughter. Prince Lysander of the Westering Isles was his name, a man whose kingdom was rich in trade routes and military might, a powerful ally that the king desperately needed. You find yourself standing in the royal receiving hall, the air thick with the usual suffocating perfume, a mixture of rosewater, and a hint of something more exotic that was a new addition to the arsenal. The court is buzzing, a strange mix of nervous excitement and thinly veiled terror. This is not just a diplomatic visit, it's a test. The king's grand deception, the lie that had consumed his kingdom for years, was about to be put on display for a man who was not a subject, but a potential political partner, a man who had no reason to lie and every reason to be offended by one. Mainstream historical records of the time mention the Treaty of the Silver Crown, a landmark diplomatic agreement that secured the kingdom's western borders and opened up new trade routes. The histories describe the marriage of Princess Theodora to Prince Lysander as a key component of this treaty, a beautiful political alliance forged in love and mutual respect. This is the official story, the one that the chroniclers, under the king's watchful eye, would write. It is a story of fairy tale romance and political savvy, a beautiful lie meant to cover up a far more grotesque reality, a quirky tidbit that you learn from a trusted old courtier, a man who's been at court longer than you've been alive, is that Prince Lysander was known for his remarkably keen sense of smell. His island kingdom, surrounded by the sea, was a place of constant fresh breezes, and its people, according to the old courtier, were hypersensitive to any kind of impurity in the air. He was a man who, rumour had it, could tell the quality of a wine simply by the scent of its cork. This detail, a seemingly innocuous piece of gossip, sends a shiver of dread through you. The king had not just invited a suitor, he had invited a human bloodhound. Historians still argue whether the king was aware of Prince Lysander's unique sensitivity. Was this a calculated risk? A desperate gamble that the prince would be so enamoured by the princess's rumoured beauty and her immense dowry that he would overlook the stench? Or was it an act of pure desperation, a king so consumed by his lie that he genuinely believed that no one could possibly discover the truth? The answer is lost to time, but the scene that is about to unfold will be a testament to the king's supreme and perhaps fatal arrogance. The prince arrives, a figure of striking elegance and physical prowess. He's not the dandy of the court's imagination, but a man of the outdoors with a tanned face and a confident stride. He moves through the receiving hall with an easy grace, his eyes taking in the gilded splendour with a cool, appraising gaze. He bows to the king, and then his eyes fall on the princess's private entrance, a velvet-draped archway that has been carefully scented with 1,000 lilies. The court holds its collective breath, a silent, terrified chorus. The moment of truth has arrived. The princess, or rather, the illusion of her, is presented. She's wheeled in on a heavily decorated sedan chair, the curtains drawn. You can just make out the delicate silk veil that covers the open front, a piece of fabric so finely woven that it looks like a wisp of smoke. She's a myth, a legend, a rumour made flesh, and her very appearance is a work of art. But even through the heavy veil and the layers of perfume, there is an unmistakable miasma that precedes her, a sickly, sweet and sour odour that is so familiar to you, but so alien to the prince. You watch as the prince, his face a mask of polite expectation, takes a step toward the sedan chair. The court musicians on cue begin to play a lilting, romantic melody, their music meant to fill the silence and distract from the olfactory assault that is about to happen. The prince stops a few feet away and you see it, a subtle but unmistakable change in his expression. His nose, a sharp aquiline feature, twitches. His nostrils flare. He takes a deep breath, a breath that you know is a terrible mistake. His eyes, once so cool and confident, widen just a fraction. He looks at the king, his gaze a silent question. The king, a man who has mastered the art of professional smiling, smiles back, a fixed, terrifying rictus. The prince, a man of breeding and decorum, does not flinch. He does not recoil. He does not turn and run. He simply takes a small, almost imperceptible step back. His initial pleasantries, the ones you had heard he had rehearsed, are forgotten. He simply bows his head and offers a polite but very formal greeting to the king. He does not speak to the princess. He does not offer a word of praise. He simply acknowledges her presence, and then, with a kind of clinical detachment, he turns his attention back to the king and begins to talk about the Treaty of the Silver Crown. The court exhales. The moment of crisis has passed. The prince has not exposed the lie. He has simply chosen to ignore it. The king, with a triumphant gleam in his eye, begins the diplomatic negotiations. The court, a collective of cowards and sycophants, returns to its usual chattering, pretending that nothing at all has happened. The princess, still hidden behind her veil and her curtain, is wheeled away, her presence leaving a lingering foul aroma in the hall. The lie has held. But you know, with a terrible certainty, that this is not a victory. It is simply a postponement. The prince, you realise, is not a fool. He knows. And the real game, the one that's about to unfold, is far more dangerous than anyone in this room is prepared for. The stench of the rotting princess is now a diplomatic problem, a political landmine that the king has just convinced a foreign prince to step on, and you, a silent, terrified witness, are about to see the consequences. Prince Lysander's face, you recall, was a study in controlled horror. He had not flinched, not recoiled, but his body language spoke a language all its own. A subtle step back, a barely perceptible stiffening of his shoulders, a gaze that was no longer a sign of interest but of clinical, dispassionate appraisal. The king, blinded by his own desperation and a certain amount of self-congratulatory relief, saw none of this. He saw only that the prince had not fled, had not made a public scene, and had, in a strange, silent way, agreed to continue with the diplomatic negotiations. The air of the court, so thick with fear, was now replaced by an equally thick sense of false triumph. The next few days were a blur of feasts and formalities. The king and his ministers, in a feverish rush, presented the prince with a dizzying array of trade proposals and military alliances. The prince, in turn, was a model of diplomatic efficiency. He listened, he negotiated, and he signed the preliminary documents for the Treaty of the Silver Crown. But throughout it all you notice something is terribly wrong. The prince never once asks to see the princess again. He never inquires about her health, her interests, or her well-being. He talks about her only in the most abstract political terms, as a valuable component of the treaty or the key to our new alliance. It is a cold, calculated game of political chess, and the princess is the pawn that everyone is pretending is a queen. Mainstream historical accounts of the treaty often describe the rapid and efficient negotiations as a sign of the king's political prowess and the prince's diplomatic skill. This is the official story, of course. The real story, as you are a witness to, is one of two powerful men who have reached a silent, terrible agreement. The king has offered a rotting princess and a vast dowry in exchange for an alliance. The prince, his nose still twitching with the memory of the stench, has accepted the alliance but has not, in his heart of hearts, accepted the princess. A quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit you overhear from a stable hand is that the prince's personal valet was seen buying every last bottle of a specific potent variety of cedar oil from a local apothecary. Cedar oil was known for its strong, astringent scent, a scent that was meant to be cleansing and fresh. The valet, you learn, was not buying it for his master's clothes, but to be burned in a constant procession of censers in the prince's private chambers. The prince, it seemed, was attempting to cleanse his very soul of the memory of the princess's stench, a constant reminder of the terrible bargain he had made. Historians still argue whether Prince Lysander's acceptance of the marriage was an act of personal sacrifice for his kingdom or a cynical power play. Did he agree to the marriage because he knew the alliance was necessary for his people's survival? Or did he see the princess as a broken, easily manipulated tool that he could use to consolidate his own power? The prince's motivations are a mystery, but the outcome is all too clear. He was a man who had been repulsed by the princess, but who, for the sake of his kingdom, had agreed to a marriage that he would never ever truly consummate. The king, in his blind victory, was already making plans for the wedding. It would be a spectacle, a grand public display of royal power and diplomatic triumph. The court was in a frenzy, the weavers working overtime on a new wedding gown, the jewellers polishing the royal tiara, the perfumers desperately trying to create new, even more potent scent that could, for one day, mask the truth. The princess, you know, is the centerpiece of this grand deception, a human sacrifice on the altar of her father's pride. You find yourself feeling a peculiar kind of empathy for Prince Lysander. He's not a villain, but a man who has been forced into an impossible situation. He's a man who came to court a beautiful, vibrant princess, and instead found a rotting ghost. He's a man who, for the sake of his kingdom, has been forced to make a terrible, humiliating bargain. He is, in a way, just as much a victim of the king's lie as the princess herself. The princess, meanwhile, remains a ghost in her own story. She's a name, a title, a piece of a diplomatic treaty, but she is never seen, never heard. Her voice is silenced, her thoughts unrecorded. She's a passive object in a game played by men, a living testament to the fact that in the world of royal politics, a woman is often nothing more than a commodity. You can only imagine what she thinks of all this grand spectacle that is being prepared for her, this wedding to a man who, she must know, is marrying not her but her crown. The king's hubris has reached a fever pitch. He is convinced that he has pulled off the greatest deception in the history of his kingdom. He believes that the lie has been cemented, that his throne is safe, and that his daughter's terrible secret is finally irrevocably buried. He's a man who has convinced himself that he is a genius, a master manipulator, and you know, with a terrible certainty, that this kind of pride always, always comes before a fall. The wedding is not a happy ending, it is the beginning of the end, and the stench, a constant terrible reminder of the king's lie, is about to become a national crisis. The wedding day arrives, a day of immense public spectacle and private horror. The streets of the capital are lined with people, a sea of cheering faces waiting to catch a glimpse of their beloved princess. They have been told a story of a great love, of a princess so beautiful that she must be veiled from the common eye, and they have, in their naive innocence, believed every word of it. The king, in his final act of theatrical desperation, has created a public myth that is a complete contradiction to the rotting reality that he has so carefully hidden. The royal procession is a magnificent display of wealth and power. The prince, resplendent in his westering regalia, rides a magnificent white horse, his face a mask of stoic solemnity. Behind him, on a gilded carriage, sits the princess. You watch from your position in the crowd of courtiers, a silent, terrified witness to the grand deception. The princess is once again a ghost in her own story, a figure so heavily veiled and shrouded in layers of silk that she is barely a person at all. The carriage itself, you notice, is a kind of mobile perfume bomb. with censers burning in every corner and perfumed oils dripping from the wheels. The stench, a constant, terrible presence, is now being broadcast to the entire city. Mainstream historical accounts of the wedding are filled with flowery descriptions of the princess's ethereal beauty and the unshakable love between the royal couple. These histories describe the wedding as a day of national celebration, a unifying moment for the kingdom. They speak of the princess's humility in choosing to wear a veil, and the prince's chivalry in accepting her choice. These are the beautiful lies that the king's chroniclers wrote, the fictions that would be passed down for generations. The reality, as you know, is that the princess's veil was a necessity, not a choice, and the prince's chivalry was a cold, calculated act of political self-preservation. A quirky and deeply unsettling tidbit you overhear from a palace decorator is that the wedding chapel was not just adorned with flowers, but with thousands of tiny perfume sachets sewn into the tapestries and hidden behind the pillars. These sachets, you learn, were filled with a mixture of dried lavender, rose petals, and a powerful resinous gum that was meant to neutralize even the most foul of odors. The chapel, a place of spiritual sanctity, had been transformed into a chemical warfare zone, a desperate final attempt to win the war against a single, terrible stench. Historians still argue whether the princess's acceptance of the marriage was an act of a desperate woman or a final tragic act of obedience. Did she agree to marry a man who she knew was repulsed by her in order to secure her father's kingdom? Or was she a helpless pawn, a voiceless victim in a game that she had no control over? The princess's voice, like her face, is lost to history. She's a silent participant in her own wedding, a beautiful, tragic object in a political negotiation. You watch as the ceremony unfolds. The prince, his face a grim mask of resolve, stands at the altar. The princess, a beautiful perfumed mannequin, is led down the aisle by her father. The king, a man of immense pride, walks with a stiff, almost robotic gait, his smile a terrifying rictus of triumph and fear. The air is thick with the scent of flowers and lies, and the entire kingdom is holding its collective breath, waiting for the marriage to be sealed. The moment of truth comes with the exchange of vows. The prince's voice is clear and strong, his promises of love and devotion a hollow, chilling performance. The princess's vows are a single, almost inaudible murmur, her voice so weak and fragile that you can barely hear it over the music. She's a woman on the brink, a human being who has been pushed to her absolute limit. You can only imagine the terror and humiliation she must feel, standing at the altar with a man who, she knows, would rather be anywhere else in the world. The moment the wedding is sealed, the prince and princess are declared man and wife. The crowd outside erupts in a deafening cheer, a sound of collective joy that is a terrible ironic counterpoint to the quiet tragedy unfolding inside the chapel. The king, his mission accomplished, lets out a small, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. He has done it. He has married his rotting daughter to a powerful prince and secured his kingdom's future. He has won. But you know, with a terrible certainty, that this is not a victory. This is a temporary reprieve, a short-lived triumph before the final inevitable fall. The prince, a man of pride and power, is now the owner of a lie. He has married a woman who, in his mind, is a walking testament to a kind of moral and biological decay. He has been forced to make a public show of affection for a woman who repulses him, and he has been tricked into a marriage that he will never, ever truly accept. The king's great lie has not been exposed, but it has been transferred. It is no longer just the king's problem, it is now the prince's, and you know, with a kind of morbid certainty, that a man like Prince Lysander is not one to suffer a humiliation in silence. The stench of the rotting princess is now a powder keg, and the fuse has just been lit. The court, relieved and joyous, celebrates the marriage with a lavish feast. The prince and princess are seated at the head of the table, their chairs separated by a small but significant distance. The princess remains shrouded in her veil, a silent, mysterious presence at her own wedding dinner. The prince, a model of polite indifference, engages in conversation with the king and his ministers, never once looking at his new wife. The lie holds for now, but the air is thick with a new kind of tension, a quiet, simmering resentment that is far more dangerous than the open disgust of before. The princess is no longer just a problem for the king. She is now a problem for the man who has been forced to marry her. And you, a silent witness to it all, are about to see what happens when a man of power and pride is humiliated in the most intimate way possible. The royal wedding, a spectacle of lies and desperation, was over. The kingdom's heir was married, the alliance secured, and the public, blissfully ignorant, celebrated in the streets. But for you and for the prince, the nightmare was just beginning. The princess, no longer just a national secret, was now a private horror, a personal tragedy that had been foisted upon a man who had no choice but to accept it. Her gilded carriage, a symbol of her new status, now bore her to a new palace, a home that was about to be corrupted by her presence. The new royal residence, a magnificent structure built on the cliffs overlooking the sea, was a testament to the prince's refined taste. It was a place of light and air, with large windows that opened to the fresh, salty breeze and gardens that were filled with aromatic herbs and delicate, sweet-smelling flowers. This palace, so different from the king's musty, perfume-choked court, was a perfect symbol of the prince's world, a world of order, cleanliness, and clarity. But as the princess's sedan chair was carried through the gates, you see it happen, the slow, insidious corruption of a pristine place. The first thing to go was the scent of the sea. The crisp, clean air, a hallmark of the Westering Isles, was slowly but surely replaced by the familiar, sickly sweet miasma that you'd come to know so well. The gardeners, a bewildered lot who had never smelled anything but the clean earth and the fresh sea air, began to complain. Their delicate flowers, the ones that were meant to fill the palace with a subtle, beautiful fragrance, seemed to wilt at the princess's approach. The aromatic herbs in the garden, the ones that were meant to be used for cooking and medicine, now seemed to have a faint cloying smell to them, as if they had been dipped in a vat of decaying fruit. The palace was, quite literally, being poisoned by the presence of its new mistress. Mainstream historical documents from this period often describe the princess as a recluse who preferred the solitude of her new home, and a prince who graciously respected his wife's private nature. This is, of course, a lie. The reality, as you know from the whispers of the palace staff, was far more tragic. The prince had not willingly given his wife her solitude, he had forced it upon her. The princess was confined to a separate wing of the palace, her windows sealed, her doors locked, her every need attended to by a small circle of specially chosen servants who had been sworn to secrecy. She was a ghost in her own home, a silent, unseen presence whose only sign of existence was the stench that permeated the very stone of the new palace. A quirky and deeply morbid tidbit you overhear from a laundress is that the prince had ordered a new kind of soap, a harsh, abrasive kind that was meant to be used to scrub the stone floors of the palace. The soap, a powerful, lye-based concoction, was meant to cleanse the palace of its new, terrible odour, but it failed. The laundress wrote in her diary that the smell of the rotting princess was not a simple filth that could be scrubbed away. It was, she believed, a part of the very air, a kind of spiritual pollution that had settled on the soul of the house. Why, Duff, this was the kind of madness that was setting in. The idea that the princess's condition was not just a physical illness, but a kind of moral or spiritual corruption. Historians still argue whether the prince's decision to isolate his wife was an act of cruelty or self-preservation. Was he a cold, unfeeling man who simply could not bear to be near his wife? Or was he a man who was trying to protect himself and his kingdom from a horror that he could not understand and could not cure? The truth, you suspect, is a muddled mix of both. He was a man of logic and order who had been confronted with a problem that defied all logic, and his only solution was to contain it, to lock it away and pretend that it did not exist. The new palace, a place of light and air, was slowly but surely being transformed into a tomb. The open windows were sealed, the beautiful gardens were neglected, and the prince, once a man of the outdoors, now spent most of his time in his private study, a place that was as far away from his wife's wing as he could possibly get. He was a man who was living a lie, and the palace, his beautiful, pristine home, was a constant, terrible reminder of the terrible bargain he had been forced to make. You feel a strange kind of sympathy for the prince. He is a victim of the king's grand deception, a man who has been forced to live with a horror that he did not choose. He's a man who has to pretend to love and honour a woman who he cannot even bear to be in the same room with. He is a man who has been stripped of his home, his peace and his happiness, all for the sake of a political alliance. He is, in a way, just as much a prisoner of the king's lie as the princess herself. The princess, meanwhile, remains a silent, unseen presence. She is a myth, a legend, a ghost who haunts her own home. Her voice is silenced, her thoughts unrecorded, and her existence is now a terrible, pervasive stench that has corrupted the very air of the palace. She is a woman who has been robbed of her life, her love and her humanity, and her only legacy is the rot that has seeped into the stone of her new home. And you know, with a terrible certainty, that this can't go on forever. The prince, a man of pride and power, is not one to suffer in silence. The rot is spreading, not just in the princess's body, but in the heart of the kingdom itself. And the prince, a man who has been humiliated and deceived, is about to take his revenge. The end, you know, is about to begin. You have watched Prince Lysander's transformation from a proud, stoic diplomat into a man consumed by quiet resentment. The initial shock and disgust have given way to a cold, simmering anger, a rage that he directs not at the king, but at the silent, unseen woman who has become his wife. He is a man who was promised a queen and was given a corpse, and the humiliation of it all has turned him into a shadow of his former self. His palace, once a testament to his refined taste, is now a symbol of his shame, a prison for both his wife and himself. His resentment, you learn, manifests in 1,000 small, cruel ways. He does not speak to her, not even through an intermediary. Her food is brought to her by a small army of servants who have been given strict instructions never to look her in the eye. Her private gardens, once filled with delicate flowers, are now neglected and overgrown, a physical manifestation of his neglect. He spends his days in a feverish, almost obsessive pursuit of order and control, as if by arranging every book on his shelf and every piece of furniture in his study, he can somehow undo the terrible chaos that has entered his life. Mainstream historical narratives of the time often describe the prince's retreat from public life as a sign of his deep devotion to his wife, his desire to give her the privacy she so desperately needed. This is a beautiful lie, a fiction that was carefully crafted to preserve the illusion of a happy marriage. The truth, as you know, is that the prince's retreat was not an act of love, but an act of self-preservation. He was a man who could not bear to be in the presence of his wife, and so he created a world for himself that was as far away from her as he could possibly get. A quirky and deeply morbid tidbit you overhear from a palace scribe is that the prince had a new law passed, a kind of bizarre royal edict that required all the flowers in the palace gardens to be of a certain non-fragrant variety. The scribe wrote in his journal that the prince had become obsessed with the idea of a scentless world, a kind of sensory deprivation that he believed would cleanse him of the memory of his wife's terrible stench. The scribe noted, with a kind of morbid fascination, that the prince seemed to believe that by controlling the scent of his world, he could somehow control the rot that was slowly but surely consuming his life. Historians still argue whether the prince's resentment was a natural reaction to his humiliation, or a sign of a deeper psychological imbalance. Was he a man who was simply lashing out at the woman who had been foisted upon him? Or was he a man who was slowly but surely going mad, driven to the brink by a horror that he could not understand and could not escape? The answer, you suspect, is a muddled mess of both. He was a man who had been humiliated in the most intimate way possible, and his resentment was a slow, creeping poison that was consuming him from the inside out. The princess, meanwhile, remains a silent, unseen presence. She is a myth, a legend, a ghost who haunts her own home. She's a woman who has been robbed of her life, her love, and her humanity, and her only sign of existence is the rot that has seeped into the stone of her new home. She's a prisoner of her own body and her husband's neglect, a silent victim in a marriage that is a mockery of the love and a testament to the power of lies. The prince's isolation and resentment grew with every passing day. He became a man who was incapable of joy, a man who was consumed by a quiet, simmering rage. He spoke to no one, and he trusted no one. He was a man who was living a lie, and the palace, his beautiful, pristine home, was a constant, terrible reminder of the terrible bargain he had been forced to make. His kingdom, so dependent on the new alliance, was now being ruled by a man who was slowly but surely going mad, a man who was so consumed by his own personal tragedy that he had all but forgotten his public duties. You find yourself feeling a strange kind of sympathy for the prince. He is a victim of the king's grand deception, a man who has been forced to live with a horror that he did not choose. He is a man who has to pretend to love and honour a woman who he cannot even bear to be in the same room with. He is a man who has been stripped of his home, his peace, and his happiness, all for the sake of a political alliance. He is, in a way, just as much a prisoner of the king's lie as the princess herself. The princess, meanwhile, remains a silent, unseen presence. She is a myth, a legend, a ghost who haunts her own home. Her voice is silenced, her thoughts unrecorded, and her existence is now a terrible, pervasive stench that has corrupted the very air of the palace. She is a woman who has been robbed of her life, her love, and her humanity, and her only legacy is the rot that has seeped into the stone of her new home, and you know with a terrible certainty that this can't go on forever. The prince, a man of pride and power, is not one to suffer in silence. The rot is spreading, not just in the princess's body, but in the heart of the kingdom itself, and the prince, a man who has been humiliated and deceived, is about to take his revenge. The end, you know, is about to begin. The prince's silent resentment, you see, was a slow-burning fuse. It was a poison that seeped into his every thought, his every action, and his greatest fear was not just that he had been deceived, but that the rot itself was contagious. He was a man obsessed with a kind of sterile purity, and his wife, the rotting princess, was a constant, terrible reminder of his own vulnerability. He had locked her away in a remote wing of the palace, but he knew, with a terrible certainty, that the walls he had built were not high enough to keep the truth from seeping out. But a new chapter in this tragic story was about to unfold, one that would force the prince to confront his greatest fear in the most profound way imaginable. The princess, a silent, unseen figure in her own home, was with child. The news, when it finally reached the prince, was not a cause for celebration, but for a cold, sickening horror. He was a man who had been forced to marry a woman who repulsed him, and now he was being forced to accept the physical, biological proof of their union. He was a father, a man who would now have a child that, he feared, would carry the same curse as its mother. Mainstream historical records of the time described the birth of the new heir as a joyous occasion, a symbol of the strength of the new alliance and the promise of a long and prosperous dynasty. The royal chroniclers wrote of a child of immense beauty and vitality, a testament to the happy, loving marriage of its parents. This is the official story, the one that the world was meant to believe. The truth, as you know, was a far more tragic and chilling affair. A quirky and deeply morbid tidbit you learn from a midwife who attended the birth is that the child, a little girl, was born with a faint but unmistakable odour. It was not the strong, sickly sweet miasma of the princess, but a faint, almost imperceptible hint of something wrong, a kind of musty sweetness that a mother-to-be might notice on her infant's swaddling clothes. The midwife, a kind and experienced woman, wrote in her journal that the smell was the saddest scent in the world, a kind of premonition of the tragedy that was to come. She noted with a kind of heartbreaking clarity that the baby, for all her health and beauty, was a walking, breathing testament to her mother's curse. Historians still argue whether the child's condition was a direct genetic inheritance from her mother, or a simple, terrible coincidence. Was the rot a kind of familial curse that would be passed down from one generation to the next? Or was it a new, and even more terrifying manifestation of a disease that defied all understanding? The answer is lost to time, but the effect was all too clear. The child, the new hope of the kingdom, was a physical, biological link to the rotting princess, a living, breathing testament to the king's great lie. The prince's quiet resentment, a slow-burning poison, now turned into a cold, terrifying rage. He saw the child not as a daughter, but as a biological threat, a living, breathing extension of the woman who had ruined his life. He was a man who had been promised a pure, untainted bloodline, and he had been given a child who, he feared, was already beginning to decay. He was a man who had been humiliated and deceived, and now he was faced with the ultimate proof of his humiliation. He was a man who was pushed to his absolute limit, and he was about to break. The princess, a silent, unseen figure, was now a mother. You can only imagine the terror and humiliation she must feel, giving birth to a child who, she knows, is already carrying the same curse as she does. She is a woman who has been robbed of her life, her love, and her humanity, and her only legacy is the rot that has seeped into the stone of her new home, and the curse that has been passed down to her own daughter. She's a woman who has been pushed to her absolute limit, and you sense with a terrible certainty that she is about to reach the end of her endurance. The prince, in his cold, terrifying rage, began to make plans. He was a man who had been a prisoner of the king's lie, and he was about to set himself free. He was a man who'd been humiliated and deceived, and he was about to take his revenge. The child, his beautiful doomed daughter, was the ultimate proof of his humiliation, and he was about to use her to bring the entire kingdom to its knees. The king, a man who had won his diplomatic victory, was about to face the ultimate defeat. The rot, a secret that had been so carefully hidden for so long, was about to be exposed in the most public, most terrifying way imaginable, and you, a silent witness to it all, are about to see the end of the fairy tale and the beginning of the nightmare. The prince's quiet resentment, a slow burning poison, had finally reached its boiling point. The birth of his daughter, a living breathing testament to his humiliation, was the final straw. The king had not just given him a rotting wife, he had given him a rotting legacy, a tainted bloodline that would haunt his kingdom for generations to come. He was a man who had been pushed to his absolute limit, and his cold, calculating mind began to formulate a plan. He was not a man to suffer in silence, and he was about to take his revenge in the most public, most devastating way imaginable. The opportunity came with the child's christening. It was a day of immense public ceremony, a time when the entire kingdom would gather to see their new princess for the first time. The king, still basking in the false triumph of the wedding, had planned a grand spectacle, a public parade where the child, a symbol of his kingdom's prosperity, would be presented to the cheering crowds. This was the moment the prince had been waiting for, the perfect opportunity to expose the king's grand deception and bring his kingdom to its knees. Mainstream historical records of the christening describe it as a day of national joy, a moment of profound hope for the future. The chroniclers wrote of a beautiful, healthy child, and a loving, devoted father who presented his daughter to the kingdom with immense pride. This is the official story, the one that the world was meant to believe. The truth, as you know, was a far more tragic and chilling affair. The prince, in a calculated act of cold cruelty, was about to shatter the illusion of a perfect kingdom and expose the terrible rot that lay at its heart. A quirky and deeply unsettling tidbit you overhear from a courtier is that the prince had instructed the royal chroniclers to prepare two different versions of the christening story. The first was the beautiful lie, the one that would be read to the public. The second, a far more chilling document, was a detailed account of the princess's illness, a list of all the physicians who had failed to cure her, and a damning testimony from the prince himself about the deception he had been forced to endure. The prince, it seemed, was preparing for war, and his weapon was the truth. Historians still argue whether the prince's decision to expose the lie was an act of justice or an act of pure, unadulterated revenge. Was he a man who was simply trying to right a terrible wrong to expose a deception that had consumed his life? Or was he a man who was so consumed by his own rage and humiliation that he was willing to plunge two kingdoms into chaos just to get his revenge? The answer is lost to time, but the effect was all too clear. The prince, a man who had been forced to live with a lie, was about to become the man who told the truth, and his words would be a dagger aimed straight at the heart of the king's power. The christening day was a beautiful, sun-drenched morning. The streets were filled with cheering people, and the royal procession was a magnificent display of wealth and power. The king, his face a mask of pride and false triumph, rode at the head of the procession, his chest puffed out with a kind of arrogant self-satisfaction. The princess, a silent, unseen figure, was nowhere to be seen, a detail that the public had come to expect and accept. But the child, the beautiful doomed daughter, was there, a tiny, fragile figure in her father's arms. You watch as the procession reaches the great square, a place of immense public gatherings. The prince, his face a grim mask of resolve, holds his daughter up for the crowd to see. The crowd, a sea of cheering faces, roars its approval. They see a beautiful, healthy child, a symbol of their kingdom's future. But then, the prince does something that no one expects. He holds a hand up for silence. The crowd, confused but obedient, falls silent. The king, his face a mask of bewildered confusion, looks on in silent horror. The prince, his voice clear and strong, begins to speak. He does not talk of love or devotion. He talks of lies and deception. He tells the crowd about the princess, his wife, a woman who is not a saint but a prisoner, a woman who is not beautiful but rotting. He tells them about the king, his father-in-law, a man who had deceived him, a man who had foisted a terrible lie upon him for the sake of political power. He tells them about his daughter, a child who, he fears, is already carrying the same curse as her mother. And then, in a final devastating act of revenge, he removes the child's swaddling clothes, exposing her body to the crowd. The child, you see, has a faint but unmistakable discoloration on her skin, a kind of mottled pallor that is a terrible living testament to the rot that lies at the heart of the kingdom. The crowd, which had been a sea of cheering faces, is now a silent, horrified mass. They see the truth, a truth that they had been so carefully shielded from. They see the lie that their king had been telling them for years. They see the child, a symbol of their kingdom's future, as a living, breathing testament to its decay. The cheers turn into gasps of horror, then into a roar of outrage. The king's great lie has not been exposed. It has been ripped apart, and the terrible rot that lay at its heart is now on display for the entire kingdom to see. The prince's revenge is complete. The king's pride has been shattered, and his kingdom is about to descend into a chaos that no one is prepared for. The stench of the rotting princess is no longer a private horror. It is a public scandal, a national crisis that will change the course of history forever. The prince's calculated act of vengeance, a public unveiling of the royal secret, was not a whisper, but a scream. The horror that had been confined to the palace walls for so long was now a public spectacle, a raw and undeniable truth that no one could ignore. The crowd, a sea of cheering faces just moments before, was now a silent, horrified mass, their minds reeling from the shock of the revelation. The cheers had been replaced by a low, angry murmur, a sound that was far more dangerous than any roar. It was the sound of a kingdom waking up to a terrible truth, the sound of trust shattering into a million pieces. You watch as the king's facade, a lifetime of carefully constructed arrogance, crumbles before your eyes. The rictus of a smile that had been plastered on his face melts away, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He looks at his son-in-law, a man who he had so arrogantly believed he had outsmarted, and he sees not a prince but a judge, a man who is about to pass a terrible sentence on him and his entire kingdom. The king's world, a world built on lies and deception, is about to come crashing down. Mainstream historical records of the time mention a period of intense civil unrest and political instability following the christening of the new princess. The official story, of course, blames the chaos on foreign agitators and a small group of traitors who sought to destabilize the kingdom. This is a lie, a final desperate attempt by the chroniclers to rewrite history. The truth, as you know, is that the chaos was caused by the king's own deception, a lie that had festered for so long that its public unveiling was like a match thrown into a powder keg. The people, who had been so loyal and so trusting, now felt betrayed, and their betrayal turned into a righteous, consuming rage. A quirky and deeply morbid tidbit you overhear from a stable hand is that the crowd, in its rage, did not attack the prince, but instead turned on the royal chroniclers, the men who had been so instrumental in perpetuating the king's lie. They were chased through the streets, their quills and parchments torn to shreds, their beautiful lies exposed for the world to see. The chroniclers, the masters of the written word, were now the victims of a mob who had finally discovered the power of the truth. It was a bizarre poetic act of revenge, a testament to the fact that, when a lie is big enough, the truth is a weapon far more powerful than any sword. Historians still argue whether the prince's act of public exposure was a good thing for the kingdom in the long run. Did he save the kingdom from a corrupt, lying king, or did he simply plunge it into a chaos that it was not prepared for? Was his act one of courage, or one of pure, unadulterated selfishness? The answer is lost to time, but the effect was all too clear. The kingdom, which had been so stable and so prosperous, was now teetering on the brink of a full-blown civil war, and the rotting princess, a silent, unseen figure, was the catalyst for it all. The prince, his act of revenge complete, did not stay to watch the chaos unfold. He simply turned and walked away, his face a grim mask of a man who has finally found his freedom. He didn't look at the king, he did not look at the child, and he did not look at the princess, his wife, who had been the cause of it all. He simply walked away, leaving the king to face the consequences of his own lies. The prince, a man who had been a prisoner of the king's deception, was now a free man, and his freedom had been purchased with the public humiliation of the entire royal family. The king, in a moment of pure, unadulterated terror, tried to regain control. He ordered his guards to arrest the prince, but the guards, who had just heard the same terrible truth as the crowd, simply stood there, their faces a mask of confusion and betrayal. The king, a man who had commanded an army with a single word, was now a man who could not command a single guard. His power, a lifetime of carefully constructed authority, had evaporated in a single moment, a single, devastating act of public truth-telling. You, as a silent witness, see the tragic end of a man who had so desperately tried to control his own narrative. The king, a man who had believed he was a master of his own destiny, was now a man who was a victim of his own lies. He was a man who had so desperately tried to hide a terrible secret, and in doing so had created a monster that would eventually destroy him. The princess, a silent, unseen figure in her own home, was no longer a personal tragedy. She was a national crisis, a symbol of a kingdom that was rotting from the inside out. And the people, who had been so carefully shielded from the truth for so long, were now ready to tear the kingdom apart to get their revenge. The stench of the rotting princess, once a private horror, was now a public rallying cry, a symbol of the king's deception, and a call for a new kind of justice. The court, a place of silent, terrified compliance, was about to be turned into a battlefield. And you, a silent witness to it all, were about to see the end of a dynasty, and the birth of a new and terrifying kind of world. The public exposure of the princess's condition was not an isolated incident. It was a domino effect of chaos. The prince's calculated act of vengeance, so devastating in its simplicity, had unleashed a tidal wave of outrage that the king's court was completely unprepared for. The people, who had felt a lifetime of quiet resentment toward the king's arrogance and extravagance, now had a focal point for their anger. The rotting princess, a symbol of a kingdom that was decaying from the inside out. The king, a man who had commanded a kingdom with a single word, was now a man who could not command his own guards. The court, once a place of silent, terrified compliance, was now a place of open rebellion. The courtiers, who had so eagerly participated in the king's deception, were now turning on each other, a pack of wild dogs fighting over the scraps of a dying dynasty. They pointed fingers, they confessed to the king's lies, they did anything they could to save their own skin. The king's beautiful lie, a fortress of deception, had become a prison of his own making, and the doors had just been kicked in. Mainstream historical records of this period are a muddled mess of half-truths and contradictory accounts. They talk about a purge of the old court, a time when a new, more honest government was established. This is a lie, a final attempt by the historians to impose order on a time of utter chaos. The truth, as you know, is that the purge was not a professional, orderly affair. It was a panicked, desperate attempt by a dying king to find a scapegoat for his own failures. A quirky and deeply morbid tidbit you overhear from a palace groundskeeper is that the king had his most trusted advisors, the men who had helped him craft the lie, thrown into the dungeons. They were not given a trial, they were simply left to rot, a terrible poetic end for men who had helped a king hide a terrible rot. The groundskeeper wrote in his journal that the stench from the dungeons, once a mix of stale air and old stone, was now a mix of fear and decay, a kind of mirror image of the princess herself. Historians still argue whether the king's actions were an act of self-preservation, or a final desperate act of madness. Was he a man who was simply trying to find a way to survive the chaos he had created? Or was he a man who had finally, irrevocably lost his mind, lashing out at the very people who had helped him? The answer is lost to time, but the effect was all too clear. The king, a man who had so desperately tried to control his own narrative, was now a man who was a victim of his own lies, a man who was now being consumed by the very chaos he'd created. The princess, meanwhile, remains a silent, unseen presence. She's a myth, a legend, a ghost who haunts her own home. She's a woman who has been robbed of her life, her love, and her humanity, and her only sign of existence is the rot that has seeped into the stone of her home. She's a woman who has been pushed to her absolute limit, and you sense with a terrible certainty that she is about to reach the end of her endurance. The princess, a silent, unseen figure in her own home, was no longer a personal tragedy. She was a national crisis, a symbol of a kingdom that was rotting from the inside out, and the people, who had been so carefully shielded from the truth for so long, were now ready to tear the kingdom apart to get their revenge. The prince, his act of revenge complete, did not stay to watch the chaos unfold. He simply turned and walked away, his face a grim mask of a man who has finally found his freedom. He did not look at the king, he did not look at the child, and he did not look at the princess, his wife, who had been the cause of it all. He simply walked away, leaving the king to face the consequences of his own lies. The prince, a man who had been a prisoner of the king's deception, was now a free man, and his freedom had been purchased with the public humiliation of the entire royal family. The king, in a moment of pure, unadulterated terror, tried to regain control. He ordered his guards to arrest the prince, but the guards, who had just heard the same terrible truth as the crowd, simply stood there, their faces a mask of confusion and betrayal. The king, a man who had commanded an army with a single word, was now a man who could not command a single guard. His power, a lifetime of carefully constructed authority, had evaporated in a single moment, a single devastating act of public truth-telling. You, as a silent witness, see the tragic end of a man who had so desperately tried to control his own narrative. The king, a man who had believed he was a master of his own destiny, was now a man who was a victim of his own lies. He was a man who had so desperately tried to hide a terrible secret, and in doing so had created a monster that would eventually destroy him. The princess, a silent, unseen figure in her own home, was no longer a personal tragedy. She was a national crisis, a symbol of a kingdom that was rotting from the inside out. And the people, who had been so carefully shielded from the truth for so long, were now ready to tear the kingdom apart to get their revenge. The stench of the rotting princess, once a private horror, was now a public rallying cry, a symbol of the king's deception and a call for a new kind of justice. The court, a place of silent, terrified compliance, was about to be turned into a battlefield, and you, a silent witness to it all, were about to see the end of a dynasty and the birth of a new and terrifying kind of world. With the prince's departure and the king's power shattered, the court descended into a state of furious, terrified chaos. The courtiers, a pack of wild dogs who had once so eagerly licked the king's hand, were now turning on each other, a bloodbath of accusations and confessions. But in the midst of this madness, a strange and terrible quiet had fallen over the west wing of the palace. The princess, the catalyst for it all, was now a forgotten figure, a silent, unseen presence who had been left behind in the wreckage of her father's kingdom. The king, a man who had once been so obsessed with controlling his daughter's image, was now too preoccupied with his own survival to even think of her. He was a man who was fighting for his life, and in his final, desperate moments, he did something that was both an act of cruelty and an act of strange, terrible mercy. He had her exiled. Not to a foreign court, not to a nunnery, but to a remote, desolate castle on the coast, a place where the wind howled and the sea gnawed at the cliffs. It was a place of immense beauty and profound isolation, a fitting tomb for a woman who had been a prisoner her entire life. Mainstream historical records, in their final desperate attempt to salvage the king's reputation, described this as a merciful act, a way for the princess to live out her days in quiet contemplation, away from the cruel gaze of the world. This is a beautiful lie, a final fiction written to soothe a kingdom's troubled conscience. The truth, as you know, is that the exile was a punishment, a way for a dying king to rid himself of the physical, biological proof of his own failure. He was a man who could not kill his daughter, but he could banish her, a final act of cowardice that was as heartbreaking as it was predictable. A quirky and deeply morbid tidbit you learn from a guard who was tasked with escorting the princess to her new home is that she was not sad. The guard, a simple man who had been terrified of the princess for years, wrote in his journal that she seemed relieved, a kind of quiet peace that he had never seen in her before. He wrote that she looked out at the sea, at the endless expanse of blue and grey, and that for the first time in his life he saw a woman, not a monster. He wrote that the princess, a silent, unseen figure for so long, had finally found her voice, not in words, but in a kind of quiet, dignified silence. Historians still argue whether the princess's final days were a time of peace or a time of profound, soul-crushing loneliness. Was she a woman who had finally found her freedom in her isolation? A woman who had been set free from the lies and the perfumes and the heavy silks? Or was she a woman who was simply left to rot alone, a final terrible victim of her father's grand deception? The answer is lost to time, but the effect was all too clear. The princess, a woman who had been a prisoner her entire life, was now a prisoner of her own body and her own isolation. The castle on the coast was a place of immense, brutal beauty. The wind howled through the open windows, the sea roared against the cliffs, and the air, so clean and fresh, was a kind of new, terrible torment for the princess. She was no longer a prisoner of perfume, but a prisoner of the truth, a woman who could now smell her own decay without the heavy, cloying scent of flowers and incense to mask it. She was a woman who was finally, irrevocably forced to confront the terrible reality of her own body. You find yourself feeling a strange kind of pity for the princess. She's not a villain, but a victim, a woman who was born with a terrible affliction, and a father who was too terrified to love her for who she was. She's a woman who was a symbol of her father's power, and now she is a symbol of his failure. She's a woman who was a ghost in her own home, and now she's a ghost in her own isolation, a silent, unseen figure who has been left to rot alone in a castle on the coast. The king's final act of banishment was a tragic, and yet a predictable end to a man who had so desperately tried to control his own narrative. He was a man who had so desperately tried to hide a terrible secret, and in doing so had created a monster that would eventually destroy him. The princess, a silent, unseen figure in her own home, was no longer a personal tragedy. She was a national crisis, a symbol of a kingdom that was rotting from the inside out, and the people, who had been so carefully shielded from the truth for so long, were now ready to tear the kingdom apart to get their revenge. The stench of the rotting princess, once a private horror, was now a public rallying cry, a symbol of the king's deception and a call for a new kind of justice. The court, a place of silent, terrified compliance, was about to be turned into a battlefield, and you, a silent witness to it all, were about to see the end of a dynasty and the birth of a new and terrifying kind of world. The rotting princess, a symbol of a kingdom's decay, had found her final, terrible resting place. The remote castle on the coast, a place of immense beauty and profound isolation, was her tomb, a fitting end for a woman who had been a prisoner her entire life. She was no longer a person, she was a legacy, a ghost story whispered in the kitchens of a new tumultuous kingdom. Her life, a tragedy of whispers and lies, was over, but her story, her terrible, pervasive stench, would haunt the kingdom for generations to come. The king, a man who had so desperately tried to control his own narrative, had fallen. His kingdom, plunged into chaos by the public unveiling of his lie, was now being fought over by the very people he had so arrogantly ruled. His legacy was not one of power and prosperity, but one of deception and decay. He was remembered not as a great king, but as the man who had a rotting daughter and who had been too cowardly to face the truth. His name, once a symbol of authority, was now a curse, a whisper of a time when the kingdom had been ruled by a man who had put a lie before his own people. Mainstream historical narratives, written generations after the fact, have tried to make sense of the chaos. They talk about a period of enlightenment, a time when the kingdom, having been cleansed of its corruption, was able to move forward into a new era of honesty and transparency. This is a beautiful lie, a final fiction written to soothe the kingdom's troubled conscience. The truth, as you know, is that the chaos was not a period of enlightenment, but a period of profound, violent change. It was a time when the old order was torn down and a new and even more brutal order was established in its place. The people, who had been so betrayed by their king, were now suspicious of all authority, and their suspicion turned into a kind of violent, unforgiving rage. A quirky and deeply morbid tidbit you learn from a historian's notes is that the castle where the princess lived out her last days was eventually abandoned. The people, in their rage and fear, refused to go near it. They believed that the castle was haunted not by a ghost, but by the terrible stench of the rotting princess. The historian wrote that even decades after the princess's death, the castle still had a faint, musty odour, a kind of phantom smell that the people believed was the physical manifestation of a kingdom's guilt. It was a bizarre, poetic end to a woman who had been a prisoner her entire life, a woman who, even in death, could not be forgotten. Historians still argue whether the princess's story was a unique tragedy, or a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power. Was she a one-in-a-million medical anomaly, a terrible twist of fate that was a tragedy of circumstance? Or was she a symbol of a deeper, more insidious problem, a metaphor for the way that lies and deception can rot a kingdom from the inside out? The answer is lost to time, but the effect was all too clear. The princess's story became a part of the kingdom's mythology, a kind of dark fairy tale that was told to children to warn them about the dangers of deception and the terrible price of lies. Her name, once a symbol of royalty, was now a symbol of a kingdom's fall. The princess's legacy, you find, is a complex and contradictory one. She was a woman who was a victim, a symbol, and a catalyst for change. She was a woman who was reviled for her illness, and yet she was also the person who, in a strange and terrible way, saved her kingdom from a corrupt, lying king. She was a woman who was a silent, unseen figure for her entire life, and yet her story, her terrible, pervasive stench, became a kind of rallying cry for a new kind of justice. She was a woman who was a prisoner of her own body and her father's lies, and yet, in her death, she found a kind of strange, terrible freedom. The prince, the man who had exposed the lie and plunged the kingdom into chaos, was a hero to some and a villain to others. He was a man who had gotten his revenge, but in doing so, he had also destroyed the life of his wife and his daughter. He was a man who had found his freedom, but in his freedom, he had also found a kind of profound, soul-crushing loneliness. His legacy, like the princess's, was a complex and contradictory one, a testament to the fact that in the world of power and politics, there are no heroes and no villains, only people who are forced to make terrible choices. The kingdom, in the end, did not find a new kind of enlightenment. It found a new kind of cruelty. The people, who had been so betrayed by their king, were now suspicious of all authority, and their suspicion turned into a kind of violent, unforgiving rage. The old order was torn down, and a new and even more brutal order was established in its place. The stench of the rotting princess, once a private horror, was now a public rallying cry, a symbol of the king's deception, and a call for a new kind of justice. The court, a place of silent, terrified compliance, was now a battlefield, and you, a silent witness to it all, have seen the end of a dynasty and the birth of a new and terrifying kind of world. The long shadow of the rotting princess, you realize, is not a story of a single person, but a story of a kingdom. It is a story of a king who was so obsessed with power that he was willing to sacrifice his own daughter for it. It is a story of a court that was so terrified of the truth that it was willing to deny its own senses. It is a story of a people who were so betrayed by their ruler that they were willing to tear their own kingdom apart. It is a story of a lie that was so big, so rotten, that its public unveiling was like a match thrown into a powder keg. And at the heart of it all, a silent, unseen figure, a woman who was a prisoner of her own body and her own father's lies, a woman who was a symbol of a kingdom's decay, a woman who, in her death, became a legend.